upwards of 75 million people in the United States, almost a quarter of the U.S. population, is part of the immigrant community, as stated by Charles Hirschman, a sociology professor at the University of Washington and the U.S. National Library of Medicine's, published in January 2015. Everyone in this room has wanted a chance at something, whether it was to play in a basketball game or get invited to a job interview. All immigrants deserve the chance to be admitted to America. First, I will talk about why these immigrants want to come to America. Then I will talk about what these immigrants do for America. And finally, I will talk about some of the public attitudes towards these immigrants in America. First, let's talk about why these immigrants want to come to America. A big reason these immigrants want to come to America is because of violence in their home countries. A big source of this violence comes from street gangs. The Maras dominate the gang scene throughout Central and Latin America. However, they are most prominent in Honduras and El Salvador. The Maras are broken up into groups based on country. However, there is no hierarchy between these groups. These groups are even broken down even further into smaller groups called cliques. These cliques typically operate in a big portion of a poor neighborhood, and they run that neighborhood, and they set rules and laws for the people who are in that neighborhood, and if the people in that neighborhood are to break any of those rules, then they get punished either violently or by other means. And those other means vary depending on the neighborhood and which clique it is. There are also transporter organizations. Transporter organizations smuggle drugs across borders between countries throughout Central and Latin America, and they have started to move up into Mexico. Once those drugs get into Mexico, they are then passed along to the Mexican drug cartels. The Mexican drug cartels are heavily armed and ruthless. They operate in areas called plazas. When there's a dispute over a plaza, they fight for it between the two cartels, and this is called a turf war. Turf wars are very bloody, and there's a lot of collateral damage to civilians living in the area where they take place. David James Cantor, director of the Refugee Law Initiative, wrote on the Refugee Survey Quarterly, published in 2014, that 1.65 million Mexicans between 2007 and 2011 have said to move residence simply due to the threat or risk of violence. Now that I've told you why these immigrants want to come to America, let's talk about what these immigrants do once they get to America. Emil F. Constant, an author and professor at George Washington University, stated on IZA, A World of Labor, an international-based research firm published in 2014, that 77% of immigrant men that come to America are employed. This means a little over 3/4 of the immigrant men in America have jobs and are working. Most of these jobs that these immigrant men are working are low-paying, labor-intensive jobs. We need the immigrants to work these jobs because most of the native-born workforce does not want to work them. Also, there is not enough native-born people to fill all the job openings that we have in America. Besides these low-skilled immigrants that come to America, there are also some very highly skilled immigrants that come to America. These highly skilled immigrants are very capable of working high-paying, high-skill-level jobs, and they have been through college. They fill vital positions at companies that the companies would end up leaving unoccupied for months if they're even able to find anyone to fill if those immigrants weren't here. The companies get them to come here by offering them H-1B visas. An H-1B visa is offered to an immigrant to bring them to America for an initial period of up to 3 years. This allows the companies to search the entire world for people to fill positions. Now that I've told you what these immigrants do for America, let's talk about some of the public attitudes towards these immigrants in America. Walter A. Ewing, a senior researcher at the American Research Council and published research by the American Immigration Council in 2015, showed that roughly 1.5% of immigrant men are incarcerated, while 3% of native-born men are incarcerated. This means that immigrant men are around half as likely to be incarcerated as a native-born man. The research shows that immigrant men are much less likely to participate in criminal activity than native-born men. Between 1990 and 2013, the immigrant population in the U.S. grew 6%. During that same time, the amount of violent crime that happened in America increased 48%. This shows that the more immigration an area receives, the less crime that it has. A study in 2014 proved that immigrant men are much less likely to participate in criminal activity than native-born men, and a separate study in 2014 tracked 1,354 high-risk individuals and found that of those 1,354 individuals, the immigrant men were much less likely to be second-time offenders than the American-born men. Now that I have first, I told you why these immigrants want to come to America. Second, I told you what these immigrants do for America. And finally, I told you some of the public attitudes towards these immigrants. All immigrants deserve to be admitted.
May I have your attention, please, with ninth graders Caden Rockwick, Lola Wagner,
Without those 75
Madison
million
Jarrett,
people who are part of the
Malcolm
immigrant
Myers,
community in America, the American
Mercedes
economy would not
Fire,
be nearly as strong as there would be
RJ
millions of
Silik,
unfilled job openings.
Stanley Hinchley, Tanner Finstune,